All right, I think we're going to get started. On behalf of the Sanford Energy Environment Club, Energy Week, and Polis, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Republican Executive Director and Duke alum Bob Inglis.
Thank you.
Bob represented Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1993 to 1998, and then again from 2004 until he lost re-election in the South Carolina Republican primary in 2010. In 2011, Bob put all his energy into pursuing free enterprise solutions to climate change. He launched the Energy and Enterprise Initiative in 2012 at George Mason University, which rebranded in 2014 to republicEn. Through republicEn, Bob educates, recruits, and organizes conservative voices for action on climate change. Also joining Bob on stage is Energy Initiative Director Dr. Brian Murray. Dr. Murray has led the Duke Energy Initiative since 2016 and is a widely recognized expert on energy economics and climate change mitigation. Without any further ado, I'll turn the stage over to Mr. Inglis and Dr. Murray.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. Appreciate that. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to do this. Bob, welcome back to Duke.
Thanks, great to be here.
When you were a student here, this was the woods, you know.
Yeah,
but
that's right.
you know, it's a environmentally LEED certified building, so you know we're doing the best that we can. It's really great for you to come back during Energy Week. As we talked about this is a whole series of activities, of student-run activities, which is why we have such good attendance here today. Really devoted to all things energy. And this is a really, really important topic to many people in this room and, of course, many people in this country.
Yeah.
So this is a fireside chat format. So imagine that there's like a fire back there.
Warm.
And we've got I've got my legs, crossed, and we're going to thoughtfully, look at each other and exchange pleasantries. But I want please just start by kind of telling us about yourself and your political history and your organization, your goals, what you help do. What's your journey been from Duke to this point?
Well, let's see. Right after graduation, I went to lunch and, no, just kidding. I won't go into that much detail. So the journey that's most relevant, I suppose, here is that, for 6 years I was in Congress, my first 6 years, saying that climate change was nonsense. I didn't know anything about it except that Al Gore was for it. And in as much as I represented probably the reddest district and the reddest state in the nation, see, I said that right here, right now in North Carolina. I'll be in Idaho next week, and I probably won't claim that brag. And Texas after that, and I'll definitely pull back on that a little bit and say one of the reddest districts in one of the reddest states. So that was my first 6 years. Then I was out of Congress for 6 years doing commercial real estate law again in Greenville, South Carolina, and ran for Congress again in 2004. And that was Inglis 2.0, the new and improved version, we thought.
What was 1.0 again?
Well, it was the old and lousy. But 1.0 was the 6 years from 92 to 98, and then 2004, 2010. I thought I'd be there a lot longer than 2010, but they're having a tea party. And I was specifically uninvited to the tea party. I thought that I was a nice enough guy, they should invite me, but they specifically uninvited me to said tea party. So I'd committed various heresies, and it's sort of interesting to consider the sort of my life as a measuring life of climate action. By the time that I'd gotten back there in 2004, it was okay for Republicans to be talking about climate change. Sure, in Inglis 1.0, Al Gore had been identified as the climate guy, and so there's a sort of reaction against him. But then by 2004, it's becoming more apparent to everybody that it's real, right? And then comes the couch ad with Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich early 2008. If you Google Gingrich, Pelosi, and couch, it's the only time they've ever been on a couch together. But you'll see it. It's an ad.
So far.
And don't go there and think about that, all right? But anyway, We don't agree on much, do we, Newt? No, Nancy, but we agree climate change is real. We need to do something about it. That was early '08. By the end of '08, Newt had switched. We don't know. Sadly, so had John Boehner, so had most of the Republican leadership. And so I was over there saying, no, it's still real. It's still real. That's probably not a good idea with the Tea Party coming on. And so that and some other heresies got me tossed out in 2010 in a Republican runoff.
Yeah. So, I mean, what changed your mind specifically? I mean, how did you go from just reacting against Al Gore to actually believing that this was an issue that needed to be addressed? It wasn't just Nancy and Newt on the couch, right?
No, in fact, in an intervening event, by the way, between '08 and the end of '08 was the global financial crisis, right? The wheels were coming off the financial system in October of '08. And a secret Muslim non-American socialist had been elected to the White House. He's none of those things, by the way. But anyway, it became a convenient excuse, right? A convenient scapegoat. So the result was it just switched all at the end of '08. And that's what happened. But for me, the thing that had happened in '04 and why I was announced a different and the new and improved English 2.0, we called it, is a three-step metamorphosis. First step was my son coming to me. He was voting for the first time in '04, when I was running again. And so he just turned 18. So he said to me, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His four sisters agreed, his mother agreed, new constituency. You know, these people can change the locks on the doors, respond to those people. And by the way, my son was not making a classic interest group threat. He was going to vote for me no matter what. It wasn't in his economic interest to vote against me. You know, he's in college at the time. It would have been bad for Robert if I had lost by one vote. You know, he knew we were mortgaging the farmette that we live on, literally, in order to run for Congress. And so, you know, a farmette, that's when you're not making a living farming, you just pretend to be a farmer. So we had 16 chickens and 3 horses and a great big garden. We pretend to be farmers. So Robert was really saying, "Dad, I love you, and you can be better than you were before. So how about make this English 2.0, the new and improved version?" And so that was step one. Step two was going to Antarctica with the science committee, seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. Go into that if you want to. And then the third step was something of a spiritual awakening on another science committee trip, which seems unlikely given the fact that all scientists are godless. But apparently they're not, because this Aussie climate scientist, who's now become a very dear friend named Scott Heron, was showing us coral bleaching. And I could tell that he and I shared a worldview before any words were spoken, because I could see that he was worshiping God in what he was showing me. You know, St. Francis of Assisi said, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." And so Scott was preaching the gospel. I could see it in his face. I'd hear it in his voice. He was just worshiping God in what he was showing me. And so later we had a chance to talk, and he told me about conservation changes that he's made in his life in order to love God and love people. He does some things that my conservative friends might find strange. You know, he rides his bike to work. He does without air conditioning whenever his wife and 3 daughters will let him get away with in a hot place called Townsville, Australia. And he hangs the family's clothes on the line. Tries to do without the electric dryer. So I got right inspired. I want to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Note to self, do not introduce carbon tax in midst of great recession in reddest district of reddest state of nation. It will not go well for you. And it didn't go well at all. So after 12 years in Congress, I got 29% of the vote, and the other guy got the other 71%. So, and at that point, a foundation came to me and said, "You know, Inglis, unusual zoo animal, actual conservative, 93 American Conservative Union rating, you know, 100% Christian Coalition, 100% National Right to Life, A with the NRA, 0 with the Americans for Democratic Action, liberal group, 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO. I was really gunning for a 0. So they said, "We speak and write for the proposition." So that's what I've been doing ever since. I got 6 people now, 2 in DC, 1 in Wisconsin, 1 in California. 2 of us live and work from South Carolina. Facilitating a community about 10,000. It needs a couple more zeros on the end of it. I need your help here today to add to that number. And then we think we can help conservatives to enter the competition of ideas here.
So, I mean, you very publicly changed your mind about this, and you took quite a political hit. So, how are you motivating Republicans today to do what you did unsuccessfully 9 years ago? I mean, what's your theory of change here?
Well, yeah, it's to some extent the worst commercial, right? I mean, it's like, why would you want to be like him? And don't let your shadow fall on me, Inglis, when you walk by, you know. But I'm here to tell you something very exciting, is all that's sort of in the past now. This is a brand new decade. We think that the decade of disastrous disputation is over. It started in 2009, and it ended in 18, or really started at the end of 2008 and ended at the end of 18. And the ending point was when Republicans lost control of the House. Because now I think Republicans realize, oh, you want the majority back? Well, it goes through suburban districts. And tell me how you can win those suburban districts with a retro position on climate. The answer is you won't. And so Republicans have come around. It may also be some other things. I mean, that's the most, I'm speaking to politically savvy people, so I'll tell you that's probably the most strongest determinant of the change, right, in the ending of the decade of disastrous disputation. But there are some other elements to it as well. One is the economy's better. Another is we've all had more experiences with climate change. You know, when I was talking about in 2009 and got tossed out in 10, it seemed like it was a decade or more away. It's a while away. We're worried about the global financial crisis now. Let's talk about climate change later. But now the impacts are upon us. And then a third difference, it's sort of substantive, I think, is that there are more groups like ours messaging on the right, using the language of conservatism. And that's making a difference. But most, I think, and I'll give you some proof of this assertion that the decade is over. February 6th, press release, Republican side of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, headline, Republicans are focused on realistic solutions to climate change. The next week, the 3 leaders on the Republican side, Shimkus, Upton, and Walden, penned an op-ed. That was the lead sentence in the op-ed. The next week, Frank Lucas of Oklahoma, my friend and former colleague, or I guess I'm his former colleague, who's the ranking on science, had a Republican witness, Joe Makett from the Niskanen Center, as the Republican witness at a hearing. It was the first time in literally a decade that there was a Republican witness of a scientist saying that in agreement with the scientific consensus on climate change. And then fast forward to 2 weeks ago, Kevin McCarthy in Washington Examiner is quoted as saying, we've got to get real on climate change. So that's the Republican leader most recently saying that. So the evidence I'm submitting that the decade of disastrous disputation is over, which is very exciting. So our theory of change is it really is sort of like when the facts overtake your ideology, it's better to be overtaken than to continue to dig into that ideology. And that's where I think my party is realizing that the facts have overtaken us.
Now, is this one, I mean, I don't know, you were the one who said you were kind of thrown out of the party, but I don't know how much you maintain contact with your former colleagues in Congress, in both the House and the Senate. But is this the kind of thing where, you might have a private conversation with them and there's, much more similarity than what they feel comfortable saying and doing in public?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of members of Congress who are, and I keep in contact with various friends there. There are a lot of members of Congress who are aware that this is a problem. They do want to talk by cell phone. They don't want to show up at an event with you, at this point. But but they're aware that something is, I mean, they're generally smart people. It's just that politicians are afraid of the people they represent, but they are terrified of the activists in their own parties. And that's true on the left and the right. Jerry Nadler, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, told me one time, he said, it's exhausting representing my district. He said, I represent part of Manhattan, it's the most liberal district in the country. He says, I got to wake up every morning figuring out how to out-liberal my district. He said, it's exhausting. Really, he just told me this one time at lunch, and so that's Jerry, right? He's on that left-hand wall. And then you got people over here. Some will go nameless. One just came to mind, but I'll skip that. On the right wall over here, because he's terrified of any daylight appearing between that wall and him, because that's where that primary opponent rises, in that daylight over there. And so same thing happens on the left wall. And so what we think we've got to do, further answer to your theory of change thing, is we at republicEn.org need to create a constituency. So as that guy comes off the wall, I got to come up with a better phrase than that, don't I? You don't want to be off the wall. But anyway, as that guy ventures out here into Solutionville, he and she feel supported and not like they're about to succumb to my fate in a Republican primary.
So, in terms of who you're trying to reach, so you mentioned the suburbs. You mentioned your son, so I think implicit in that is, the numbers I've looked at is views on climate change differ quite a bit by age within the Republican Party.
Right.
So, part of it is basically, naked political strategy, but, but something that comes from a very strong foundation that you said. But right before we came on the air, you were talking about a recent visit to Vernal, Utah, which, I think you said 78% of the revenue for Vernal, Utah comes from oil and gas. How do you reach somebody like that? Do you try to reach somebody like that? Is that part of the political possible or political impossible?
We do try to reach them. I was just saying, Brian, I was just in Utah week before last, and started in Vernal, which is this little town. Anybody from Utah? Look at that. Do you know Vernal? Oh, it's a great place. I mean, and so it was a good place to start, because when you go to Salt Lake City or Provo and Logan and Ogden, the other places I was speaking and traveling and talking to people, those are prospering. And then you have Vernal, which could collapse if oil goes away, right? And so here's my message there. It's basically and by the way, we had to get pre-certification of the message, because I was sort of invited to speak to the chamber, but then the guy said, I got to talk to him first to figure out what he's going to say. And so I told him what I was going to say, and he said, oh, good, it's not hippy-dippy, you can come on. And so, and then the radio guy told me, if he starts talking like a communist, I'm going to cut him off. That's what he said to my guy. And so apparently I didn't talk like a communist, because he did the whole segment. So anyway, so knowing we're going there and it could be tough, right? So what we think you got to do is just give people the straight facts. And what I said to them is, learn from us in South Carolina in the textile industry. When the multi-fiber arrangement expired in 2005, textiles went under the bus. It used to be that the shirt material had to be American cloth. You could sew it in the Dominican Republic or in Costa Rica, but this cloth is American cloth. Not after 2005. The textile industry went kaput. And so thankfully for us, BMW came along, because BMW means Bubba makes wheels, and that's why they came to Spartanburg, South Carolina. And so they're making some very fine cars in Spartanburg right now. And they have about $7 billion on the ground in Spartanburg. And they literally replaced the textile industry. I mean, if you count up the jobs, direct jobs and the supplier jobs, they replaced the textile industry. So we're now Bubba makes wheels now. It doesn't make textiles anymore. And so In Vernal, you can't exactly say that because BMW is not coming to Vernal because there's just not enough people to have a plant that large. So the tough message is, okay, oils can be around for a good long time, but you're going to have competitive pressures on that. There can be other competitors in that space. And so what are you going to do? And you need to, so it's sort of a tough love message. There's no easy answer to that. Mm-hmm. I will tell you that Mitt Romney has an admirable answer, I think, is that he, at the Sutherland Institute recently, was saying that he was floating the idea of a carbon tax. I'm not saying that he's full-throatedly endorsing it yet, okay? He was floating the idea, and he said perhaps 10% of the revenue from it could go to a fund to help communities that will be affected. And that would, I think he has in mind Vernal, Utah, because he realizes that that's where they get their money for roads and bridges and libraries and everything that goes on in Vernal comes from a very important industry, which is the oil business.
We're gonna get back to carbon tax in just a moment. I do want to get to that. But I wanted to talk about one other sort of way of framing the issue. And so, in 2014, a published study out of the Fuqua School of Business here at Duke by Campbell and Kay introduced the notion of solution aversion. And the idea is that, you observe that people of different political persuasions have different perspectives on scientific issues like climate. And so in the particular case of climate, these researchers conducted a survey, and they found that in their population, Republicans stated more skepticism of climate science than Democrats. I think that's something that we generally observe, and that's controlling for factors like age and income and education. So the paper kind of started to explore why that might be the case, because it isn't, no one really believes it's something about the brain function of different people. I mean, maybe some people believe that, but these scientists didn't do that. So a lot depended, they found out a lot of it depended on what the respondents believed was going to be the solution, the policy solution to climate change. So there's like two flavors of that. One is very much big government, regulations, restrictions, and if you believed, so they ask you, what do you think the policy solution is supposed to be? If you believe it's a big government restriction regulation solution, you tend to be more skeptical of the science, not of the solution, but of the science. And that was true across both political parties. Now, one political party believed that was more likely to be the policy solution than the other. Right. On the other hand, if you believe that the solution was just going to be induced innovation, then those people were less skeptical of the science. And so another term for this is motivated reasoning and all that. Yeah. What do you think of that? Does that make any sense to you?
Absolutely. In fact, I haven't read the paper, but that's what we believe to be that plus an inferiority complex is the reason that conservatives haven't engaged in climate.
In what do you mean by inferiority?
Well, I think that the conservatives apparently think we're no good when it comes to energy and climate. We don't have an answer. And if you don't have an answer, you keep on talking to me about this silly marathon you want me to run in. I don't want to run in a marathon. You ever stood at the end of that finish line? I don't know if you run marathons or not.
I ran one.
And people look like they're
You don't
dying
have to
when
do
they
it.
come
I did it
across
for
that
you.
finish line. I know. So, I mean, if you keep on telling me about something that I don't want to talk about because I'm no good at it, then I'll shrink away from it, right? I'll change the subject. And that's what conservatives have done. But on the inferiority complex thing, what we try to tell conservatives, you're the kid in the class with the answer. Raise your hand. Simply internalize negative externalities. I can say that here. You see, I once said that to the Greenville News, the largest newspaper in the district I represented, and the guy stopped me and said, "What'd you say?" And then I repeated it, and he said, "I can't write that in the paper, man. We write the 7th grade level." But anyway, you know what I'm talking about, and therefore I won't explain it. That's all it's about. And conservatives know that's the answer. They know it's bedrock conservatism. So raise your hand. Just internalize the negative externalities and then let the free enterprise system sort this out. Without the government telling you which fuel to use and how to do it, just internalize the negative externalities. Eliminate all the subsidies and attach all the cost. And now compete. Okay, so that's that's one thing. But the other thing is solution aversion is definitely present. That's what we think we encounter all the time. It sounds irrational, until you think, if you don't think you got a good solution, then you doubt the existence of the problem. But I think I said this to the Focus kids last night at East Campus, is here's the plan of surgery for that back problem you're having. First, we're going to take your head off. After we've got your head off, we can work on your spine and put your head back on. Thanks, Doc, I'm feeling a lot better. I don't have a back problem. If that's your solution, I don't have a problem. So think about what conservatives heard. The UN, with their blue helmets, is going to get with the US EPA, and they're going to regulate your very breath. If that's your solution, we don't have a problem. Because none of that is attractive to a conservative. And so what we come along and say is, okay, that's not us. We don't want to do that. We want to figure out a way to do this in a way that uses the power of the American market to accomplish the objective and get innovation happening. So yes, solution aversion, I think, goes a long way to explaining what happened as things turned the wrong way in this decade of disastrous disputation. There's also, I should say, there's some people who spent some well-timed money to create doubt where very little doubt existed. And they were not creating out of whole cloth. People were already looking for a way to get that worry bead off the strand. And so they were interested in hearing that message. And so some people spent some well-timed money to drive that message and to blow some smoke.
So, a lot of attention has been drawn, and we're kind of focusing on sort of one end of the problem here, and a lot of attention has been drawn to climate denial on the right, and especially the loud denial that you're just sort of alluding to. But there's movement in progressive circles to tie climate action to a much, much wider social agenda, social program agenda. And the Green New Deal would be that. Like if you look through it, it'd say climate, but we need labor unions. We need minimum, not just minimum wage, but lifetime income. Things like that are very big on the progressive agenda, and saying climate, you can't separate climate from that. So how does that help you? So what do you think of that? Like, how does that help you? Does that help advance this notion to conservatives, or does it, I mean, it probably hurts, but I mean, is there some weird kind of dynamic where that actually helps because the alternative is the Green New Deal?
Yeah, I think there is a weird dynamic that may actually help. But when it first happened, when AOC first burst on the scene, I thought, oh golly, this is awful. Now we're all socialists who are working on climate change, right? And so that was just pretty bad. And actually, I was in the Bronx with her on the Chris Hayes show, and she was greeted there like a rock star. There were like 450 people there and cheering for her.
And we're there for you?
And in the breaks, they said, "We love you." And then I realized they weren't talking to me. They were clearly not talking to me. They were talking to her. Okay, I got it now. But anyway, so, and some guy called me a moron in the midst of it. And I gave her the side eye just to see what she'd do. And then she, on cue, said, "Wait a minute, we don't do that. That's the difference between me and Trump," she says. And so thankfully, she did correct the guy that called me a moron. But what I said was, I think I'm witnessing the formation of the Tea Party of the left. And I think you can be about as effective as the Tea Party of the right was. And so...
how did that go over?
They didn't like that.
Yeah,
the
crowd, did they call you a moron before that, or
no,
after that?
That was what prompted the moron comment. And but then again, what's happened is that who would have thunk that Matt Gaetz, Florida 1, Republican, big-time Trump guy, would come out with the Green Real Deal in response to the Green New Deal. And the only thing I can use to explain that is that he's I think he's 35 or so, 35, 36 years old. And I think it's that he wants to be true to his age cohort. He said some really bold things about how Republicans this is a very conservative member of Congress from Florida 1, saying that Republicans are going to be harshly judged by history if we don't deal with climate change. And so I think it's just a matter of him being 35 or 36 years old. That's her age, and they're like, wait a minute, if you're in this age group, you got to address climate change. It's sort of like being on the Kent State campus, let's say in 1968 or 69, and holding a sign saying, the communists are going to get Australia next. Vietnam's a dagger pointed at Australia, right? You wouldn't want to be holding that sign because, while you maybe not, a long-haired hippie smoking the pot and burning your draft card, nevertheless, you didn't want to be holding such a sign, right? And so I think that that's where Matt Gaetz is saying, listen, to be true to my age cohort, I've got to say that climate change is real. Let's do something about it. So actually, she may help us. Yeah, it's a bank shot, but it could come around to help us.
Okay. So we're going to get wonky now, as promised. We'll talk about carbon price and carbon tax. It's a really kind of central part of your message is the price on carbon is the way to go. You invoke Milton Friedman and free markets. And in fact, right now, there are, by last count, 6 bipartisan carbon tax bills in Congress. None of them probably at this point, people would mortgage the farmette on it yet. But there are 6 bills out there, and some of them are pretty aggressive. And so, for transparency, I've worked on carbon pricing bills for a better part of a decade, and going back to those times of 2008, 2009, when people were out, and I've done that both, research but direct policy advice at the national, state, and provincial level in Canada as well. So I'm a fan.
Yeah.
However, there's a big issue right now, which is a carbon tax. I think you propose it primarily as maybe the only policy. At least that's as I read your materials, it's the only policy, and that means that we don't have to do these other destructive things like regulation and subsidies and these things that don't play well to your own sensibilities and I think to the sensibilities of your party. However, there are others who believe that it can't just be the only thing. You have to have both a belt and suspenders. It has to be part of a broader package. And that's the state of the debate right now. There are more people, I think, who accept the notion of a carbon price, but they're not quite sure what it needs to be as standalone or part of a package. So what do you say to that?
Well, I think, a carbon tax may be a fairly weak signal in the transportation sector. And so you probably wouldn't want to dispense with CAFE standards, for example, because it just, what, $25 a ton is 21 cents a gallon on gasoline. And maybe that's not a strong enough signal. And so CAFE standards would, particularly elevating those, would continue to drive the industry. So if I were in Congress, I'd still be voting for higher CAFE standards. But what I think it seems to me that the consensus among economists about the solution to climate change is even greater than the consensus among scientists as to the cause. And that is, just start with a carbon tax. And if it's not working, then do other things. But, CAFE standards or, and another place where this price signal probably isn't so effective would be, I would think, in fugitive emissions of methane. I don't know that it's going to be that effective, right? Obviously, in some places, the methane's being flared. So it must not be that valuable a resource, right? If you were just burning it. So probably that's a regulation that would need to be added, presumably. So in other words, no, I don't think that a carbon tax is not a panacea, but it does seem to be the place where it makes sense to start.
Yeah. So it would be an unfair reading of your platform, if you will, to say carbon tax and then walk away. I think even the Baker-Schultz plan, George Shultz and James Baker, their plan coming forward was pretty pure. Like, do that, dividends, redistribute, walk away, problem done. And then you have to kind of forfeit Clean Air Act regulation authority over greenhouse gases. But it sounds to me like that maybe a more nuanced approach. Am I hearing that right? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that we do want to start with a carbon tax, so because we think it's just rock solid conservatism. We had an event one time at the University of Chicago called "What Would Milton Friedman Do About Climate Change?" Great picture, Dr. Friedman, and
Does everyone here know who Milton Friedman is? Okay,
so I'm dating myself. Okay, so he's Ronald Reagan's economics advisor and the sort of the guy that's the father of the Chicago School of Economics. If you're a conservative, you're supposed to bow at the mention of his name. I mean, he's like he and Saint Reagan are. So it was funny though. Afterwards, his son posted or tweeted or posted somewhere that it was a posthumous conscription of his father. We that he'd never said anything about climate change, so we just sort of let that go by the wayside because we had the Milton Friedman Chair of Economics saying that yes, of course, this is exactly what Dr. Friedman would do. He would put on a carbon tax. And there's a great clip on the Phil Donahue show. Okay, now if you didn't know who Phil Donahue is, or if you don't know who Milton Friedman is, you definitely don't know who Phil Donahue was. Basically, a white guy doing an Oprah show is who Phil was, right? And so in the 1980s, so they used to get on together, and so Phil says, "What do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate it?" And Friedman says, "You tax it. You tax pollution." And then he goes on to explain how it is, don't try to regulate it, just tax it. Just internalize the negative externality and then be done with it. And then the free enterprise system delivers innovation. And by the way, I should point out, that I'm expressing a great deal of faith in free enterprise that maybe not everybody in the room shares, right? But that's an awful big faith statement about free enterprise right there, that it will deliver the innovation faster than government regulations or incentives or mandates. But I believe I've got an example. In the 1980s, McKinsey was asked by AT&T how many cell phones would be in service at the year Y2K. And so McKinsey thought and came up with the answer, 800,000. Well, the only problem for McKinsey is that there were 800,000 cell phones going into service every 3 days as Y2K rolled around. So McKinsey had missed it by some numbers of orders of magnitude. But in fairness to McKinsey, some of you will work for McKinsey, no doubt, is that it was like this. I had a bag phone in my first campaign in 1992. You know what a bag phone is? That's where it's in a bag, and you actually had a cord on it. You picked it up out of a cradle, you talked on it for about $1 a minute, kept it plugged into the cigarette lighter because the battery wasn't any good. It worked in 2 of the 3 counties. That's what McKinsey was looking at. Who wants one of those, right? $1 a minute. They didn't know that the price would come down, the service would go up. And now, most of you have in your pocket more computing capacity than what we landed on the moon with. And so that's the free enterprise system. Now, admit, I'm a Republican, not a libertarian, right? That all started with DARPA. DARPA created the internet and the PC. But then the free enterprise system took over, and there were people competing to get market share, and they drove the price down, and they served their customers well. And the result was now we got these cell phones. And so we think that's going to happen in energy. And we're looking at the possibility of an energy revolution.
Well, since you pulled those 2 things, I'm just going to, put out something out there. But then everyone, I'm going to be calling on you next in like a minute. So DARPA, energy, there's ARPA-E, right? And so that is something that is with the same philosophy as DARPA, only focused on energy.
Yeah.
Is that a legitimate role for the federal government to play?
Yeah. In fact, what we say at republicEn.org, out of the current Congress, we have very modest hopes. And largely, they're both being met. One is constructive hearings. And as I just said, Frank Lucas, my friend, Oklahoma ranking Republican on the Science Committee, had a hearing with Joe Maket there. And so that's a constructive hearing. So constructive hearings. And then second, is more ARPA-E projects. And there are a number of bills that have made progress in the Senate that are really aimed at ARPA-E kind of expansions, where you give the Department of Energy money to incentivize new technology. And so yeah, and again, I'm a Republican, not a Libertarian. I realize some Libertarians wouldn't like that because they're saying, why should the government be funding that kind of research? But I think there's a role for government in funding basic research.
I think Dr. Friedman would say there's a third party that benefits here, and so that's, that's the justification.
Yeah.
We actually do at the Energy Initiative, we do have a former director of ARPA-E now as an executive in residence, so we're glad to have that. Okay, so there's only one technical thing I need to tell you. When you ask a question, actually I'd like, there's one non-technical and one technical. You're gonna be first, by the way. Please say your name. But before you do that, press the button in front of you so that it can be in there. So, and name and like where you're from and all that. So.
My name is Kelly Riley. I'm at the MPP, in the MPP program.
Yeah.
I moved here from Wyoming, but I'm not from there. But I did actually have a question sort of related to Wyoming. I'm curious what you would say, we're talking about carbon tax not being sort of based on a regulatory system, despite having maybe regulatory components. But I am curious what you would say to John Barrasso or someone who would maybe see that tax as a proxy regulation due to the fact that so much of the economy in somewhere like Wyoming is based on coal. And so having a tax that would potentially kill that industry, I'm curious how you would kind of market or sell that idea.
It's hard because it's like, the situation in Vernal, and I've also had opportunities I was in Muhlenberg County one time in Kentucky talking this, and God told me, he crossed the arms like, he says, son, you realize you're in coal country? And I said, yes, sir, I do. I was hoping that my tires on my rental car were still okay in the parking lot. I think it's hard. Kevin Kramer of North Dakota has actually was the first first Republican to float a carbon tax since the guy from South Carolina did in 2009. He did it in 2017 because he wants to fund carbon capture and sequestration work with the carbon tax revenues. And I think that Kevin is thinking rightly about that if you want to save lignite coal in North Dakota, you better find a way to do carbon capture and sequestration, because it seems inexorable that there's a price coming on carbon dioxide in some way, some form. And so if you're going to try to save that resource, figure out how to sequester it. And so it's a hard conversation, but it's like the conversation, in Alaska. Same conversation there with Senator Murkowski. There are a number of places like that where, what do you do? But I remember, back to the textiles again, I remember as a member of Congress from South Carolina, as 2005 came around and the multi-fiber arrangement was about to expire, I was saying to the textile leaders in South Carolina, okay, let's get together. What are we going to do? What's our plan? And the reality was there is no plan, because once the American consumer, all of us, figured out we could have cheaper clothes and great variety from Vietnam and China and elsewhere, well, who needs South Carolina fabric? Boom, under the bus. And so there was nothing to be done. I mean, it's like, well, what we're going to do is we're going to try to be more agile in the domestic market. That's what they said. And we're going to shrink our operations, but we're going to respond more quickly to Macy's, who needs a style change within weeks rather than months. That was the answer. So I'm not really answering your question. I'm just acknowledging that it's really hard. But when you have Lisa Murkowski, for example, take her. She realizes that the tundra is in trouble. She realizes the potential of a dramatic feedback loop that we really don't quite understand. And yet she knows her state is dependent on the revenues.
If this were an easy problem, it would have been fixed.
Yeah.
There and then back. This gentleman over here, and then go to you. You.
Congressman, I'm Steve Slauson. I'm from Oklahoma.
Yeah.
I'm in the oil and gas business.
Yes.
I'm in favor of the carbon tax.
Hey, Gary. Good.
And I'm trying to, one reason I'm here is to get some answers on how I might delicately work on changing the mind of my peers. I don't think that most conservatives are against the tax as much as they are concerned where that money will be spent.
Yeah.
And I think they're also concerned about this, because you know, U.S. is about 15% of world emissions. If the carbon tax cuts our emissions by half, are we, and the other countries don't follow suit, are we really affecting change? And how much do we put our arm behind our back, waiting for the other countries to follow suit?
Yeah, so Steve, you're onto two key things. One is Republicans don't trust the government to give the money back in the form of dividend or corresponding tax cuts. They don't believe they don't believe it'll be revenue neutral. I mean, we go around talking about a carbon tax, but we insist on it being two things. One, revenue neutral, and second, that there be a border adjustment, and that answers your second question. So the first one is it's got to be revenue neutral, which means you cut taxes somewhere else or you dividend all the money back in the form of an Alaska Permanent Fund check, something like that. But there's such a break in trust that really conservatives don't believe that will happen. And by the way, there's plenty of evidence that it doesn't happen. Some of you probably drive across bridges somewhere that were told just to pay for the bridge. Remember? Well, the bridge was paid for 50 years ago. There's still, or 20 years ago, the bridge is still being tolled, right? Okay, so, or in South Carolina, we had an education lottery. It was going to plus up the funding for education. No, the legislature just cut the funding to education, so basically, education came out about the same, right? And so there are plenty of evidence that you can't trust the government to cut taxes if they're going to put on a new tax, cut existing taxes. So that's a problem. And so what I say to folks is, if it's not in the four corners of the bill, don't vote for it. Just don't take it on the come. Just say, if it's not in there, don't vote for it. But the second point you raise is really important, and we haven't mentioned it yet, is there's got to be an effective border adjustment that all of you, I'm sure, understand. But it's we think that this is how it is that you get some of those folks that are a little bit hesitant about this plan to really get on board. Because if we simply outsource our productive capacity to places that don't have a price on carbon dioxide, we not only lose employment, we lose the race, and we believe it is quite a race to reduce emissions. Because once they pick up and move from here and go to China, let's say, they're going to emit more there than they're emitting here, because we're more energy, we're more efficient in the use of our energy than they are in China. And so double loser that way. And so you got to get them in. We think there's a way to do it through a border adjustment that we presume China would challenge in the World Trade Organization, but we think they lose based on precedents in the chemical industry that say you can have a content tax. I'm not a trade lawyer, but I've gotten good advice from trade lawyers who say that if it's a content tax, described as a content tax, so you're basing the tax on the content of the stuff coming in and the carbon content of it, carbon dioxide content, then it'd be permissible. And so if it's upheld, we think that China 24 hours later would have the same price on carbon dioxide. Because otherwise they're paying on entry into the United States a tax that's being remitted to Washington. If they had collected that tax in China, the tax money would have ended up in Beijing. 24 hours later, they've got the same price on carbon dioxide. And then you have the whole world following. And for conservatives, and say this to your conservative friends in Oklahoma, did you notice? No international agreement. No UN. No bowing and scraping and protracted negotiations. Just a bold move by the United States that says, we're thinking you probably want access to our market. Fine, bring your goods in. Just you're going to pay our carbon tax on entry. because carbon emissions anywhere are climate change everywhere, and now we're going to collect it. And then make your own decisions after that about whether you want one at home or whether you want to keep on paying our carbon tax. Inasmuch as we have currently a $1 trillion annual deficit, we would be happy for you to continue to pay our carbon tax. But you're probably going to find it in your interest to do your own. And then worldwide, you have 7 billion people seeing on their meters the actual cost of electricity and the actual cost of gasoline. And then you have a market push, like for cell phones. And so that's what we're after.
Yeah, I think in the case of China, who's instituting a carbon price now, this will just accelerate its coverage across the economy and across the country. Yeah. And again, name and button.
Yeah, and by the way, it'd be interesting, wouldn't it, if we were subjected to a border adjustment by the Chinese?
Yeah.
In other words, if we were exporting Dreamliners from
I
Charleston,
kind of have
South
a feeling
Carolina,
how this might go. I don't know.
yeah, if we were sending a Dreamliner from Charleston, South Carolina to China, and they said, well, just a moment, we're going to have to pay our carbon tax on entry here into China. That'd be quite a wake-up call for Americans. Like, wait a minute, we're supposed to be leading this thing.
And then,
Hello. Oh.
you. Sorry. Yeah, no, go ahead. I'm just pointing out you could be next. And you could be
Hello. Thank you very much for coming to speak. My name is Elliot Davis, and I'm a senior majoring in environmental science and policy. I'm also a volunteer with the local chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby.
Yeah.
So one of the things we're really working on is the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, which I'm sure you're familiar with, bipartisan carbon fee and dividend type of bill with a border adjustment. And I think currently it's 60-some Democrats supporting it and 1 Republican supporting it. And it seems like there's interest from Republicans, but a lot of them don't necessarily want to take the leap, knowing getting primary to the right and having those kind of political consequences. What do you see as the way to get those Republicans that are interested but very reluctant to be willing to take that leap?
May Citizens Climate Lobby multiply. That would be one way of doing it. And just so, if anybody's, make sure you're familiar, I'm on, full disclosure, I'm on the board of the C3 of CCL. And so they're this amazingly self-aware organization. Most environmental groups are completely unaware of their circumstances. So I won't name the names of the groups, but there are a bunch of environmental groups who think that everybody loves them, that they are acceptable left and right and center. No, no, no. The right hates you. They spit on the ground at the mention of your name. But CCL knows that only 10% of their people identify as center-right, 10% center, and 80% progressive. And so they're desperately trying to grow their right wing, and that's where we partner with them. And so they're self-aware, wonderfully so. And so that's what it takes. It's just growing this right wing. That's what it's going to take. I mean, the reason that only Francis Rooney is on that bill, a Floridian who's sadly retiring, is that there's not enough support over on that right-hand wall. And the Citizens Climate Lobby Conservative Caucus is helping us fill that space on the wall. And as a result, some more Republicans will be able to say, yeah, we're for this. I can see a way now that I could survive my primary and be responsive to my kids and grandkids. You know, I was in Oklahoma, and I mentioned my friend Jim Inhofe. Thankfully, I had said all kinds of nice things about him because he's a wonderful guy. I mean, I know that everybody in the room probably thinks he's a terrible human being, but he's actually a wonderful human being. And Jim, I asked his staff later, when his grandkids come home from Oklahoma State, how's that conversation? They finish the sentence. Oh, he's had that conversation with them. You know, that the grandkids are saying, Grandpa, you realize what you're saying on the Senate floor is not what they're teaching us at Oklahoma State. And so, anyway, so that's what it takes is building some support on that wall so that I'm not sure we'll get Jim Inhofe to come around, but we will get others and more than just one, like you pointed out.
Actually, I think one of Jim Inhofe's grandkids went to Duke. But
really?
So you have a question back there in the room, and then I think we're going to have to cut the questions off after that and mill around. So go ahead, name and all that. So.
Hi, my It's Claire Morgan. In terms of communication across differences, what are the values or concerns where you see the most potential for building common ground?
Yeah, great question. It's what you're onto is the language that we use is quite different than the language of the left, right? And the challenge is that the climate conversation has been conducted mostly in the language of the left. It's basically do with less, repent. Okay, now I'm going to give you from the perspective of a conservative. Repent, shiver or sweat in the dark, depending on the season, walk and eat bugs, attack the capitalistic system. All those things are how the right perceives the climate conversation. And so what we talk about is more energy, more mobility, more freedom. We talk about stewardship, we talk about accountability, we talk about the power of free enterprise and innovation. And so it's a completely different language. The truth is it's going to take both, in order to pull this off. But in fact, where'd my guy go that's going to hand out? I've got some cards for you. If there are plenty, you can take two. If Uncle Charlie is coming for Thanksgiving and he needs to hear from us and he needs to hear it in this other language, give him one of those cards. Take two, and one for Charlie and one for you. But so that's it. It's a different language than the language of the left. And so that's why. So you're right on it. It's not. So and what we're after here is it's not so much a lack of information as it is a lack of affinity and belonging. We think is what explains that solution aversion. Is that it doesn't fit with my tribe's ideology, and so that's what we turn around with a different language.
That's great. Varun, you have the last word here.
I'm Varun. I'm a second year MBA student, co-president of the MBA Energy Club. I don't have to be the last word on this. Someone else has a question.
Does anybody want to outbid Varun for the last spot? There's a gentleman in the back. But sir, you're going to need to step up to a microphone and tell us your name and affiliation and all that.
My name is.
I'm sorry, if you could just somebody show him a microphone. Yeah, thanks.
My name is Bohdan Oreshkevich, and that's a Ukrainian name, so you can't mess with us now, right? But I have a question. I like your optimistic point of view in terms of technical solutions, market solutions, and new products and new approaches to energy. But we can't really predict what's going to happen.
Right.
And how do we prepare that young generation? In other words, what do we educate? What's your take on education in terms of, let's say, Greta Thunberg's generation?
On how to educate them, the exciting thing is that.
Prepare them. In other words, to create them as a flexible.
Yeah. Well, that's why the polling data that Brian was talking about earlier shows that the young people with us and their parents are harder and their grandparents are really hard. That's why Charlie or your grandparents need that second card that you're taking. But I guess I'm back to that. The only answer I can give you is I'm very loose, aren't I, on this planned. Preparing, if you can change preparing to planning for how we're going to get there. I'm pretty loose on that, right? Because I don't know if we can plan it. Because, and to give you an idea about the pace of change, and I know this is going to make you think I'm really stupid, but believe me that it wasn't that unusual what I said. I remember being in the Charlotte airport about 1995 or 6, and back then, if you were to fly from South Carolina to Washington, you had to go through Charlotte. It didn't have regional jets yet, right? Okay, so that dates me right there. But so 1995, 1996, I'm in the Charlotte airport, and this guy comes up to me and says, "What's your email address?" And I was so proud because we'd just gotten some new cards printed. So I was a member of Congress, and I pulled out my card and I presented it to him. He said, "That's a website." And I said, "What's the difference?" I mean, I didn't know the difference, but I wasn't that lonely in not knowing the difference, right? I mean, in 1995 or 1996. And so just look how quickly it happened. So we think that's what's going to, that's again, back to my faith in free enterprise. That's what's going to happen in energy. And the exciting thing I think we can say to young people especially is, you know, you weren't there when they, nor was I, when they came up with the Constitution. And you weren't there when they marched in Selma. But you can be there when we solve climate change. And it is an incredible calling. And there are dark places in the world that can be lit up at night now with better batteries and better solar, for example, is probably my guess about where those dark places light up most quickly. And it's going to change the world. And you're about to be part of something really big. And so it's pretty exciting. And that's, again, a difference in presentation. That can get, I hope Steve might agree, that might cause some conservatives to say, hey, we could be for that. Now you're talking our language. We're talking like business school stuff, right? We're not talking about we're not talking about attacking the capitalistic system. We're talking about using it. I'm not really answering your question, but it's just, I'm just acknowledging that no, we don't have a 5-year plan. And I think that's better to not have a 5-year plan. That this can go faster. And if I could just say about phones, if the government had said back then, when I had that first cell phone in that bag, that we could have universal coverage for everybody in America before anybody can have another cell phone, what would have happened to the cell phone industry? It wouldn't have worked, right? I mean, I would have dragged a trailer here behind my rental car and had a technician in it to keep me in touch with my wife, probably, in such a system, right? But because it was handed over to free enterprise, they drove the price down and they competed. And so I submit that, and by the way, if all that sounds familiar and all this carbon tax sounds like, if you're a progressive and you're thinking, geez, sounding like something I've heard before, it might be because what I've just described and what we're describing here is the same thing that Al Gore has been for about 30 years, literally. And so we actually believe at republicEn.org that we might just bring the whole country together and lead the world to a solution on climate change, because we have people like on our website, if you go there, you'll find Art Laffer, one of Reagan's economics advisor, neighbor of Al Gore's in Nashville, Tennessee, been over to Al's house, talked it through, came to the conclusion it works for both of them for very different reasons. And we think that gives me every hope. When I get discouraged, I think about Art going over to Al's house. And I think about how if those two can agree, surely we can bring America together and lead the world to a solution. So it just, so I'm excited about where we are and that the solution is available. And we might just model in climate action a way out of our current partisan problem. Because we might just come to the conclusion that we're literally in this one together. You know, that maybe this is a good way to model that different behavior.
Well, that's a perfect loop. We started with Al Gore, we're ending with Al Gore. And that's the tagline I'm sure everyone's going to take home, but I'm sure that's not the one that you want them to. But thank you so much for a really, really stimulating conversation. You know, people were leaning forward. That's usually a good sign. So, so please join me in welcoming back Bob and thanking him.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone, for being here for such an amazing conversation. Let's give a round of applause both to Bob Inglis and to Brian Murray for facilitating. So I'd ask you all to join me and our speakers for some light refreshments that'll be right outside in the Commons. Workshops will start in about 5 to 10 minutes. If you signed up for them, they'll be up on the second floor. Look for the signs to direct you to those rooms. There's also going to be an energy innovation showcase. That's in Gross Hall at 6 p.m. And that's going to be a wonderful way to sort of tie up Energy Week and see some fantastic exhibitors. So if you have a chance, please go to that as well. Thank you all for coming.